This is Honors 1000, this is week 11, and this is Harman.
To say welcome everyone, in Punjabi we say Sareyanu Jiayanu.
So welcome everybody. I learned in 2016 not to make election predictions. I made one on this slide using someone else's words. And for once, the election predictions I made were not untrue. At least they weren't untrue for a while, because suddenly, after everything was messy, in an almost kind of inconceivable moment, it went from unsure to sure, and suddenly we had some results. And so this was me trying not to constantly refresh my screen, trying not to constantly figure out what was going on. And then through separate channels, I got an email from a friend of mine who lives in Europe, and that got me started down a whole path of looking around at news items, because not only was this kind of stuff happening, but I went to news sources and found this information. And this is pretty remarkable news, not just in the sense of a change in the direction of leadership in the United States, but in terms of the way that it relates to what we do as a society. Because this is exactly what we're talking about in this class. So I actually listened to the acceptance speech on Saturday night, and what I found in that speech was a pretty interesting discussion of the question of problems. There are a lot of other stuff there, but one short segment of the speech had a very explicit list of problems, and I actually have listed them here without any changes. So I just changed the bullet point, turned them into bullet points. But these are the exact words of the speech last night. And what that says to me is that this particular incoming administration has identified what looks to be 8 different problems that it wants to tackle. That's a lot. There may even be more that aren't on that list. In fact, we know there are. But it looks like these are the 8 topics that it wants to tackle. Those are the problems. And so it's done its problem identification phase already. And now that it's been elected, it has to move into that next stage, which is policy. Speech last night was really short on policy. There was not a lot of suggestion about what's going to work to fix the 8 problems that were identified. But it was interesting that in one particular place, there was a discussion of this question, and that is when the speech went on the question of COVID, and the speech turned to what would happen on Monday, that a group of scientists and experts would be convened to turn the plan into a blueprint for action. Basically what that's saying is we've identified the problem, we've identified some initial possible solutions, and now we're going to turn those into a specific blueprint for action policy. And then we have the last question, because what happens there? What happens when a series of blueprints are created? Well, those blueprints don't just go into effect. Those blueprints somehow need to be funneled through the existing set of political institutions that are U.S. government. And that's the real question that we need to think about, that we need to decide on, because that is the realm of politics. So this is the big picture of what we've heard over this weekend, the big picture that's kept me distracted from actually making these videos, and I want to apologize that they're not coming in a timely manner. I will not let that happen in the future, but there aren't any presidential elections scheduled for the next 3 or 4 weeks, so I think we're in good shape. But what there is here is something that is directly in common with what we're doing in this course, because of those 8 priorities, at least 2 and partially a third are actually precisely the issues that we've identified as problematic for the city of Detroit. The question of compensating for deindustrialization or other kinds of economic losses, in this case some of them COVID related, but others distinctly not, and the question of racial justice and sort of overarching questions of fairness. And in this particular week, in this course, we are actually discussing one of the questions that was focused on in that speech. So one of the problems listed in the speech is the problem that we're spending this week, last week, next week on, and that is the question of racial justice, which we've interpreted in terms of Detroit as the question of segregation. The question of populations who live distinct from one another, where there are high indexes of dissimilarity, and where there is a significant imbalance in resources between those 2 population groups. And so this kind of map, the map that shows almost precisely the level of unbelievable segregation that we see in the Detroit metropolitan area, again, one of the most segregated metropolitan areas in the United States according to every kind of indicator, and one in which that segregation overlays onto deindustrialization to produce the issues that we're dealing with here. This is what we've got to deal with. And after drawing out, after mapping and calculating that difference last time, what we're going to do is to talk this time about the question of segregation, not just mapping it out, but figuring out where it came from and why it got so bad and why it stayed so bad over time. So that's what I want to do. I want to do this in the form of 8 short videos. And I say short videos, this time I think I really mean it. You can probably see that it's pretty hard for me to judge the amount of time that any of these take. I always have the slides written out, I actually do rehearsals, but it's still never quite clear how long any of these explanations actually take. I am pretty confident, however, that this week they're going to be shorter than normal, which is great because you've got a whole lot of other stuff to do, and you're probably recovering from a whole lot of stuff you had to do last week and the world circumstances that might have had you, if you were anything like me, distracted. So this is what I want to do. The areas that I want to talk about initially, I want to talk about structure. That's a pretty common element for this course. Then I want to talk about institutions, and then I want to talk about agents. So we're going to go through those 8 videos. We'll get to the final video, and there we will recap. So that's going to be the big picture of what we're going to do, and let's get on with it. So let's jump to video 11b and talk about the structural basis of segregation in Detroit, and specifically the question of economic bases for segregation. I will see you there.